Welcome to the release of the policy brief, Helping the Lebanese People Move Toward Recovery, Recommendations for U.S. Policy. The policy brief is a joint effort of the Middle East Institute, the American Task Force on Lebanon, and more than 20 Middle East scholars, analysts, and experts here in Washington, D.C. We're very pleased to have opening remarks and comments from the Honorable Darrell Issa, a co-chair of the U.S.-Lebanon Friendship Caucus, a long-serving member of Congress, who on the Foreign Relations Committee is currently on the Subcommittee for International Development, International Organizations, and Global Corporate Social Impact, as well as the Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, and Human Rights. He is also a member of the House Judiciary Committee. Congressman Issa has visited Lebanon dozens of times, most recently in a non-official delegation coordinated by ATFL in November. So we're glad to have you with us, Darrell, and please give us the benefit of your wisdom this morning.
Thank you, and I want to thank both the American Task Force for Lebanon for hosting today, but also for facilitating the trip that three members of Congress, along with the ambassador, took. I think I speak for Congressman Kildee and Congressman LaHood and myself, all of whom have years of experience going back and forth to Lebanon. All of us were unpleasantly surprised, shocked, if you will, at the economic decline that we're seeing and the real hardship. We went to two villages in addition to Lebanon. One was Darren LaHood's home and the other historic home, and the other was mine. In both cases, we saw family and old friends who find themselves in an economic situation that they've never experienced, not even during the Civil War. Having said that, I think everyone on this conference is aware that Lebanon's economic decline, the financial decline of its currency, facilitated by its bank collapse, was not something that was, even though it happened overnight, it was years in coming. And that's the area that I think I'll concentrate on today. We saw great hope that there will be free and fair elections, and the United States is committed to it. We saw not just the people there, but back in the United States, a commitment to those elections with over 4 times as many non-Lebanon residents registering to vote in this upcoming election. We also met, though, with each of the leaders, if you will, what we sometimes call the 3 presidents. Each had a different reason to blame the collapse. None of them had what one might call a succinct vision to turn it around. And I think that's one of the reasons that the task force and Congress are supporting in every way we can the free and fair elections that must occur this year. I think the second point, though, and the point that that I saw in meeting with family that have been there through the war and so on, it is more than that. The elections will be a beginning of a change. And the beginning is, yes, we have to know who the players are. And then for the first time, perhaps since 1990 in any real way, there has to be accountability for all 3. We can't have each of them blaming Iran or the silent hand of Hezbollah or Syria. And that's going to be a challenge for the task force. We've supported Lebanon with I think, the support of Congress and this administration. We'll continue to provide economic support. But as in closing, in my conversations with people throughout the Gulf and other France and other countries that have historically helped Lebanon, they are asking for more. And I think that's what we saw in Lebanon was when you asked for more than just an election, many Lebanese are not yet prepared to look beyond that at the fundamental changes. In closing, there are certainly some people who get it, that confronting, if you will, responsibility by Hezbollah for the economy as much as any other group, responsibility by Iran as much as any other group. We did see some signs of it. And so hopefully that's where the task force can engage in future trips, is to make it clear that elections are the beginning of a process. They're not going to change the fundamental problems in Lebanon without follow-up. Ed, I think I covered as much as you can 4 glorious days that we spent in Lebanon. I'm still trying to lose the weight, as you can imagine.
Thank you, Congressman Issa. And I have to say that if that's the worst experience that you had was the weight loss or weight gain, then I think we're looking forward to our next visit when we go to Lebanon. I'd like to move on with the program and remind you that if you have questions and answers, at the bottom of your screen is a question and answer function. Just go into there as the questions pop into your mind, put them in there, and we'll get to them during the program. And let me introduce now our first keynote speaker, and that's Paul Salem, the president of the Middle East Institute. The partnership that ATFL and MEI have has been of great significance in Washington. We've married the most active and leading political action-oriented organization with the most astute think tank in Washington on the Middle East. In fact, the only real focused think tank on the Middle East. And a lot of the changes that have occurred have come because of putting that brain power together with our locomotion into recommendations. And this is our 3rd set now for the administration. And we feel very strongly the reception we're getting is quite positive. But I'd like Paul to give us the opportunity of an overview of the region. What's going on, the recent actions, as you all know, Saad Hariri has resigned. We have the JCPOA being negotiated. We have the problems with the constituencies inside Lebanon trying to build coalitions for the elections. There's so many things going on, and we are fortunate to have Paul Salem here to help guide us through what's going on. Paul?
Thank you very much, John. Welcome to everybody who's joining us. I want to thank Congressman Issa and his colleagues for all the support they do provide to Lebanon, to the Lebanese army, the Lebanese people, and maintaining that focus. So thank you very much there. I also want to salute the partnership that we have with the American Task Force on Lebanon, between the institution I head, the Middle East Institute, and the ATFL, represented by Ambassador Ed Gabriel and Jean Abinader here on this call, and the cooperation we have with LIFE, a group of Lebanese expats that also is very engaged in this process. Well, I mean, obviously, it's a lot of ground to cover. Lebanon is obviously in the midst of one of the biggest crises in the last century, particularly the socioeconomic crisis, which we haven't seen the equivalent of maybe unless we go all the way back to World War I, and the grave situation that prevailed there. As Congressman Issa said, this crisis was long in the making. Its roots go back to the 1990s with the deficit spending, high interest rates, pegging of the Lebanese pound and the dollar, and accumulating of a large amount of debt, and relying on influx of capital and interest rates to keep what eventually ended up being a Ponzi scheme alive as long as possible, until inevitably it all came tumbling down. What is particularly acute about the crisis that we've moved into in the last 2 years is that the, what you call them, the oligarchy, the ruling elites, in some, some might describe it as almost a criminal elite. If you add to it the port blast that happened in August of 2020, and many of the groups still are preventing an actual investigation into what happened, there's criminal action involved as well, that up to this very day, and 2 years into the biggest socioeconomic crisis of the country, the ruling oligarchy, the current government, has been unable, unwilling, whatever combination of words you want to use, there has been really absolutely no movement to do any major or significant reforms to begin to slow the continuing collapse that continues day to day, week to week. They haven't reached a bottom, they're continuing to get worse. No action to slow that decline, and no action to try to turn the situation around by reaching out seriously to the international community and to the IMF. It's a very, very alarming situation for the Lebanese population, particularly that none of the leaders, let alone taking responsibility, seem to be doing anything proactive to get the country moving in the right direction. Politically, everything is, I would say, stagnant. Yes, we hope to have, they are scheduled, parliamentary elections in May. The hopes and expectations are limited. They could be of some significance. Some groups, particularly maybe that are allied with Hezbollah, might lose a few seats, others might gain a few seats, but it won't be a complete sea change, but it might be of some significance. We have emphasized in the paper that no matter what, these elections must take place on time. There could be easily excuses made by some of the powers that be to postpone the elections. If that happens, not only will they extend the term of parliament and postpone the elections to parliament, they might also likely extend the term of the current president and postpone presidential elections, which would really be a very negative development. Hopefully, elections will take place in May. What is also scheduled to take place in 2022, if everything goes according to constitutional process, to have presidential elections and a new president at least elected towards the end of 2022. Of course, with every parliamentary election, there's also the nomination and selection of a new prime minister. As well, there will be elections for a speaker of parliament. Will the current speaker, who's been in place for 30 years, remain there, or will there be a new speaker? So parliamentary elections are important in themselves, but they also trigger elections to the three presidencies, as they're known. So it's a particularly important year. When I pull back from Lebanon, obviously its immediate neighborhood, Lebanon is completely detached from. You have a Syria which remains isolated. Its economy is in free fall. Yes, the US and some other powers are trying to engineer an electric and gas deal that would go through Syria, but Syria remains kind of blocked in terms of trade and any sort of normal relations with Lebanon. To our south, obviously, is Israel, traditional enemy, and relations there obviously blocked as well, even as Israel builds relations with Gulf countries and with Morocco and others. So Lebanon is fairly isolated in its immediate neighborhood. If we pull back, we see that Iran has a dominant role in Lebanon through Hezbollah. And we see that the international community still has a very robust role in Lebanon. And that's really the United States and the Europeans. Both the EU and France itself and separate Middle East countries have historic ties to Lebanon, have historic interest, have historic engagement with Lebanon as a Mediterranean country, as a struggling democracy, as a struggling pluralist society. So Lebanon is not completely left alone. What is missing in this picture is the traditional engagement that Lebanon traditionally had from the Arab world, particularly recently the Arab Gulf countries. This traditionally had an influence on Lebanese politics, but more importantly, it was a great pillar for the Lebanese economy. It is noteworthy that the GCC countries sent sort of a démarche, a communication to the Lebanese government, carried by the Kuwaiti foreign minister who visited Lebanon 10 days ago with a number of strategic questions. Obviously, the powers that be are not going to give the answers maybe or all the answers that the GCC would like to hear, given the influences that are there and the powers that be. But I take that as maybe a hopeful sign that the GCC is aware of the importance of Lebanon and is searching for a way, while putting the correct conditions, as the international community has and must, and the Lebanese themselves put conditions on reform and change at the political level as well as the economic level. And the GCC has legitimate conditions as well. But the GCC will have to be part of any potential revival if and when we get a government in place, a president in place, a ruling group that is actually serious about turning the situation around. I agree with Congressman Issa that the elections are important and they're a start, but it's going to be a long-term challenge, a long-term project that will extend a number of years to get the political system more responsive and more proactive, and to begin to turn the economy around from what is one of the worst contractions in human history, about a loss of 50% of GDP. So I'll just stop there. Thank you, Jean, for giving me the floor.
Jean, you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Thank you, Paul. You raised a lot of questions, particularly ones that go to the heart of the issue here about Lebanon's survival through the elections. And I appreciate also the emphasis that you placed on how much the Lebanese have to do themselves to make the future happen the way they want. And I think that brings us to remarks from Ed. Ed, I think following up on what Congressman Issa said, there's some real good news, which is that these points represent a coming together of a lot of thinkers, both in the United States and abroad, about what Lebanon needs. So that there's a policy that's emerging that you could call a Lebanon policy. How would you frame these recommendations in terms of the overall political situation around Lebanon, Ed?
Thank you, Jean. And, let me just begin by acknowledging Paul Salem, Brian Catholis, and their team at the Middle East Institute. Under Paul's leadership during the past 2 years, the Lebanon issues have really come to the forefront with the best thinking we've seen, and we have to thank them for such a good partnership. I also want to thank Joyce Karam, who's with us today from the National. She's been with us from the beginning on these issues, and she'll give you a clear analysis and insight of the issues and recommendations that we're going to talk about as well. And of course, Jean Abinader, who's moderating our panel today, who's worked tirelessly as ATFL's Vice President of Policy. Let me also thank Congressman Darrell Issa, who's been a fantastic friend of the Lebanese American community and of a good, solid U.S. Lebanon policy. Thank you, Darrell, for all that you do, past, present, and by being with us today. Also, shout out to your co-chairs, Debbie Dingle, Darren LaHood, and Charlie Chris, for all of your leadership advice and continued support on these issues. Thank you very much. So, as we enter another year and face a deteriorating economic situation in Lebanon, it's kind of hard to report any good news, I realize, but I think my job today is to try to look for the positive, and I do see some. I think there's some movement that may potentially bode well for a recovery process to potentially begin this year. And we hope the recommendations we're making will resonate with key policymakers in that regard. So now this bit of optimism I'm trying to relay, I think largely depends on the Lebanese government and whether they'll be able to bring about the fiscal and monetary policies, or whether, as happened in the past, they face interference by Hezbollah and corrupt political players, and whether or not they're willing to push back and are able to push back. Our recommendations today also attempt to address that challenge. So to open the discussion, my remarks are going to outline a sense of the partnership and the momentum that's building as we enter the most consequential year in Lebanon's history, I believe. Our panelists will, of course, get into specifics, discussions, and our recommendations. So let me just say, first of all, I see a growing and determined consensus among key stakeholders and other vested interests due to several successful diplomatic engagements. Let me give you a few. For instance, I see this administration showing the bandwidth to pay attention to Lebanon, surprisingly, in spite of the very difficult foreign policy issues that faces the White House and the Departments of State and Defense. We have a competent U.S. ambassador, Dorothy Shea, who has been empowered by Secretary Blinken and President Biden very directly to carry out the Lebanon policy, not only bilaterally, which is, of course, her mission, but also in a region-wide context as well, which is key to the continuity and strength of pushing a U.S. policy so it doesn't get lost with other issues in Washington. The U.S. continues, of course, to demonstrate its resolve and with regard to Lebanon by its visits to Europe in this regard, Lebanon, the Gulf, and by high-level visits back from our allies to the United States on the same subject. Today we have over 100 people on this webinar, many of whom are key and numerous U.S. policymakers. They're also tuning in to listen to our ways to support the Lebanese people, especially the poorest among them, and the support for the Lebanese armed forces, the internal security forces, and its education and health sectors as well. And importantly, as we've discussed, Paul has brought up, as well as Congressman Issa, having elections, they must be held on time, they must be free, and they must be transparent. We'll get into that. And with few exceptions, we're seeing really, and Daryl Issa showed us today, a bipartisan U.S. Congress is focused on this issue, with key House and Senate committees increasing their focus on policy actions with regard to Lebanon, as we've seen in recent congressional actions that we're going to talk about today, but also in bills coming forth from them. So not all is lost. The U.S. and its allies have also engaged Prime Minister Mikati and his key advisors with a common message together to encourage them to produce a package that's acceptable not only to the IMF, but also to the needs of the Lebanese people. That's yet to come, but we hope to see more action from them. Most importantly, of course, and I think Joyce is going to talk a lot about this, the U.S. and its allies are listening to the Lebanese people on the ground, civil society, the opposition parties, so that we can understand how to build common understanding of the ways that we can mutually, address the citizen needs. And finally, let me just say our policy brief today will demonstrate there's also a wide consensus among more than 20 key U.S. Lebanon experts on what needs to get done this year in order to begin a process of rebuilding in Lebanon. So I guess not all is lost. The glass may be only half full or less, but we are primed with recommendations, and we have joined in common partnership with many key allies and stakeholders to protect and advance the progress we've made thus far. The partnership, however, depends on the Lebanese people and a government that's willing to take the risk, to take on others who care more about outside interests and their own selves than a sovereign, democratic, and prosperous Lebanon. We don't have a lot of time to waste, though. And let me, with that, just turn back to Jean. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you for bringing those important points to us and help give us some shape to the next set of comments. I'm going to take a few minutes now and express my analysis of what's going on before I bring on my colleagues. I want to comment on the policy brief itself and the recommendations we make and why they're so important. First of all, as Ed said, Washington is a town where interests collide. There is always competition about what to do and why. It's no different in foreign policy. We're seeing dramatic events in the South China Sea, in Ukraine, Horn of Africa, and elsewhere that demands our attention. So why Lebanon and why now? Well, mostly it's about not abandoning a friend and partner of more than 150 years to regional pressures, both internal and external, that would like to see the independence and sovereignty of the state dissolved in favor of their own political priorities. At ATFL, we are committed to not let that happen. Yet it is a legitimate question, why Lebanon? Lebanon brings to the United States many needed assets that help our policy. At the top of the list, it's a showcase through our educational institutions there, such as American University of Beirut, Lebanese American University, of the importance of respect for women and the marginalized, support for religious coexistence, it's inclusive democracy, the V's that we have strong counterterrorism cooperation, and we host Syrian and Palestinian refugees, the highest on the basis of per capita in the world. And there are many others. Without strong support from the United States and its friends, Iran and Syria would dominate Lebanon and likely pose an increased terror threat to the United States. This does not serve American interests. In the report, we make 8 recommendations for US policy in 2022. I've collated them into 3 baskets, and I'm sure my colleagues will have their perspectives as well. Number 1 is leadership. With our partners in the international community, the United States, the Lebanese people, and people throughout the world who support Lebanon, we must maintain an emphasis on a government that acts in the interests of all the people, supports the rule of law, undertakes needed reforms, and takes steps to strengthen the sovereignty of the country. This involves building support for anti-corruption measures, equitable banking reforms, rule of law, and free and fair elections. Number 2 is making sure that we are clear in our expectations, that the government candidates for re-election and the Lebanese people know what we believe and what are the core steps that must be taken to rebuild Lebanon. This includes fair fiscal and monetary reforms, an independent judiciary to pursue financial audits through the government into the Beirut port blast, and to significantly reduce corruption at all levels of government, beginning with credible implementation of the public procurement laws. The US and friends of Lebanon should not refrain from sanctions, asset freezes, and other mechanisms to reinforce their messages. Number 3 is we need to sustain Lebanon's security through support for the LAF and the ISF, including relief for their families, training them to build respect, serious respect, and policies that support human and civil rights, and clear indications to Lebanon's neighbors that Lebanon is not a playground for their interests and ambitions. And the US must continue to support maritime border negotiations with Israel, effective anti-smuggling operations along the borders, and sustain support for Lebanon's sovereignty in regional negotiations. Yes, that's a lot to ask, yet we cannot be shy about wanting to do our part to save Lebanon from its often calloused leadership, internal challenges from Hezbollah and traditional political elites, and the desperation of its citizens, not to mention the refugees trapped in the current sickness that is Syria. Whew. With that said, I'd like to bring on our next speaker, Joyce Karam, who has been covering the region literally since her birth. Joyce's analysis, networking, and reporting for the National are well respected, and we are grateful for her time to address the temperament on the street. What are people saying about the government, about the elections? What are their hopes and feelings about the future in general? Joyce, please.
Thank you so much. It's great to be with you. Great to be among friends. I guess I'll be less diplomatic in my remarks since I'm reflecting the mood on the street in Lebanon. I definitely agree with Ed and Paul that we are in a very critical period for Lebanon. We are nearly 100 days, more or less, before the election. And while it's very important to have the election on time and not see another 5-year delay like the case was in 2013, I do think we have a humanitarian disaster at hand that's becoming very unbearable. People that I speak to, whether my family or others on a daily basis, they no longer can afford just daily needs. When you talk about, the price of fuel, the price of gas in the middle of winter, the price of meds, getting into a hospital, even basics, just the price of meat, coffee beans. This is all has reached a point that we've never seen in the history of Lebanon. And then when you look at the international response, when you look at the US response, yes, they are doing good things. They are sending security aid to the LAF. There is more visibility on the ground, but it's in no way enough to address the humanitarian disaster. I think what the US is doing now is more managing the collapse rather than resolving it. So while the elections, yes, they do present an opportunity, I don't think they will be a game changer. We have to address the situation on the ground. We have to just ask ourselves why cancer patients are not getting treatment. I mean, this is just a very urgent humanitarian situation. Now, when you look at the political parties, when you look at the upcoming election, it does look like the establishment, the ruling elite, still has a good run to actually keep its majority in the parliament. We are seeing a more active civil society. We are seeing a more vibrant, independent voices emerge in Lebanon, but in no way, these groups have the infrastructure or the political capital to overtake, the parliament. You have an electoral law that is designed by the elite to protect its majority. I mean, in a sense, the firefighter in Lebanon is the same as the arsonist, and this has to change. We do need reforms. We're still not seeing any sort of accountability in the country, and it is very frustrating when the largest non-nuclear explosion in world's history does not see one Lebanese official get sentenced. I mean, this should give the US, this should give others in the international community a pause. We saw the exit of, or the suspension of Saad al-Hariri from politics. His speech, he sighed, he almost cried, but it did not even include an apology. He was prime minister for three cabinets that oversaw the same issues that led to the economic collapse we are seeing today. So the lay of the land, the political elites, the same people who drove Lebanon to this ditch are very much still in charge. I don't think anybody on the street actually believes that President On and Prime Minister Mikati, with their best intentions, would have the will or the ability to save Lebanon. People are not naive. They know what they're up against, but at the same time, they don't have the tools. Another concerning sign about the election will be, the turnout. In 2018, I think the turnout came up to 49%. That's not going to be enough to tip the scale. So you do need to mobilize the vote. You do need to urge people to go out. Now, a silver lining in this, and I think we would all probably, I hope you all went to the Lebanese embassy and you signed up for the election, is the diaspora vote, the expat vote has more than doubled. So we could see some change there, a change in maybe 10 to 15 seats if the civil society is lucky, but even these groups, these independent groups, are not unified among themselves. Still, with that, the most urgent for Lebanon now is the humanitarian catastrophe at hand. The longer this goes, the more that the non-state actors will benefit, the more we will see fragmentation on the ground, and people, going to Hezbollah, going to others. Even there were reports that ISIS is recruiting in Tripoli in the north, paying people up to $1,000 a month, which would account to a lot these days, without resolving the humanitarian disaster, without investing more political capital in Lebanon. We have not seen Secretary Blinken make a visit. He met, Prime Minister Mikati in Scotland, but we have not seen a level of attention that the situation deserves, and managing the collapse will not be enough in the rather short or medium term to preserve the elements of the state of Lebanon. Sorry, this
Thank
is
you.
depressing. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Joyce. Those are lots to think about and consider. I think I would disagree with you on the representation of the United States to Lebanon. We've sent some of our most senior people there, including CENTCOM. So, and I think the recommendations do address a number of the points you raised, and we'll get into more of a discussion on that as we move along. And I'm glad to see the Q&A filling up. All the more reason to bring on our next speaker, Brian Catholis, now the Vice President of Policy at MEI. We've benefited a great deal from Brian's broad foreign policy experience and willingness to take on difficult tasks like the next one, which is to give us his perspectives on the recommendations and how the Biden administration may respond to them. How do they fit in the Biden administration's overall views concerning the region? As you know, we've been, particularly with Afghanistan, seeing a lot of concern being raised as to, well, what is the United States up to in the Middle East? And I'm sure Brian understands the administration and all its moving parts has to at some point develop a strategy. And hopefully they will, and be able to take our recommendations to the next level. Brian, I'm looking forward to your remarks.
Great, thanks, John, and thanks to you and Ed and everybody at the American Task Force on Lebanon. I really commend the work you've done on all of this. And in particular, and I'm glad Congressman Issa is here, the approach that you take, and I've seen this over the years, is an inclusive and bipartisan approach here in this town. And to me, that's so important at this moment where we are in America, in our own democracy. It's almost countercultural when you think about it, and you think about how divided we are as a nation. And I think the fact that not only are you thinking about this very important country that we're all attached to, though I'm, I think, the only non-Lebanese origin on this panel, but I'm honored to be part of that. That approach is so important in this town that you go there and travel, and importantly, put a focus on the Lebanese people. And that's what this report, I think, does, and does quite well, is to look at the US policy tools in the context of everything that's going on in the world, and how do you actually lift up the voices of the Lebanese people, and not just see Lebanon as just a simple piece in the chessboard, either in the competition with Iran or the broader geopolitical competition. I want to frame my remarks around two bigger picture points on US policy, and then two specific things in the recommendations. To your question of whether the US and the Biden administration in particular will be able to take this template that's offered in this report and move forward and take some of these recommendations. I think absolutely yes, but there are two key questions there. Does the administration have the will? And then does it have the capacity? On the will question, it's very much tied up with its broader foreign policy and strategic approach. As we know, in the Biden administration's first year, it was heavily focused on the domestic challenges, the ongoing pandemic, the economic crisis. In the world, its agenda, I think, was dominated by the 3 C's, COVID, China, and climate in the first year. And then in recent months, as we've seen, and especially this week, Russia and Ukraine. So even before you get to the Middle East and the broader sets of Middle East issues, there's an open question of will in terms of how the Biden administration has framed its own engagement in the Middle East versus other priorities in the world. And to me, that's an open question. Second, within the Middle East, if you look at and try to read the tea leaves, quite obviously, when President Biden came in and his senior officials first spoke of its own foreign policy in its opening weeks, when it talked about the Middle East, it talked largely about Iran and their goal of moving towards a new agreement or back to the 2015 agreement, and then ending the war in Yemen. And on both of those files, it's quite clear, they came up inconclusive as yet, though there may be news on Iran soon. And I think that question of will and where Lebanon fits within the broader foreign policy is directly linked to this issue of Iran and whether, quite clearly the negotiations in Vienna, the P5 international negotiations, have been focused almost, I think, entirely exclusively on the nuclear file, sort of a repeat of what we saw before. And to me, I understand why that's the case, but I also think it risks missing the lesson that should have been learned from the 2015-2018 period till the Trump administration pulled out, which is that the regional landscape, the landscape of countries like Lebanon and how stable they are, is very much interlinked with this broader strategic question, and America has a role. So there's a question of the will, and I don't have a clear answer. It seems to me that the current trajectory, though I agree with what you and Ed and others have said, that there have been high-level US visits, I don't know that there's a broader strategy or policy backing that. There's engagement, and I think that engagement is important. Second, and more quickly, there's a question of capacity. So it's will and then also capacity. Meaning, yes, we have a really wonderful set of leaders, including our ambassador in Lebanon, a lot of people who are focused on this. But when you look at the Biden Middle East team one year in, it's actually quite short-staffed, especially when you measure it up against the other teams that were built up pretty early and quickly, like the climate team and the China team, certainly, again, reflecting their priorities. But nonetheless, there are a number of tools at their availability, and many of which we outline in the report. In the series of recommendations, to round this out, I want to highlight two things in two areas. One is the anti-corruption, and then two, not just elections, but I would expand it to political rights and civil liberties. And these two issues, again, going back to where I started, the Lebanese people, anti-corruption and basic freedoms. These are the things that the Lebanese people themselves have been suffering from. They've been suffering from the lack of freedoms and a strong sort of anti-corruption or strong corrupt tendencies in its political elite. And on the corruption point, I just want to tell a quick story. A couple of years ago, I was in Beirut on a bipartisan think tank delegation to meet with leaders. And one of the meetings we had was with Riyad Salem, the central bank governor. And in that meeting, one of our colleagues asked a very polite but direct question about the central bank governor's possible involvement in corrupt practices and things that didn't fit with the rule of law and transparency. And Salame, who, as I understand, was just subpoenaed a few hours ago by a judge, Salame did not respond to the question. He actually got up out of his chair and he silently left the room and never came back. And I tell that story because I think this is how many Lebanese people feel, not just about this one particular leader, but a number of leaders across the spectrum that have been part of the governing elite, that their leaders have actually walked out on them in the face of very significant questions about corruption. And to the US policy point on this, what I want to stress, and going back to this notion of a bipartisan approach, and I'm so glad, again, that there's Republicans and Democrats who work with you here in the US. If you look at something like the Summit for Democracy that the Biden administration organized in December, and yes, Lebanon was not invited. It was not at the table, and I don't completely understand as an analyst which countries were invited and which weren't and the rationale behind it. But the most important thing was the outcome. And there was an outcome of a presidential initiative for democratic renewal. And if you look at sort of what was announced, again, about 3 months ago in December, in early December, There was a $424 million presidential initiative to do a lot of the sorts of things that this report by MEI and ATFL talks about specific to Lebanon, including supporting free and independent elections, fighting corruption, and a number of things. And I highlight this because there are tools available. There are tools that have been outlined by the administration themselves that, yes, though global in nature, could be applied to these two specific files. One, anti-corruption. So if there are, and we know that there's been some action here, and not only the Biden administration, but the Trump administration tried to use some of the tools that we have with the Treasury Department and sanctions to essentially highlight those who've been lining their pockets and not listening to their own people. What the Biden Summit for Democracy outlined included a US strategy for countering corruption. What better place than Lebanon these days to actually try to apply some of these tools? And again, the report, Jean, Ed, Paul, Joyce, this highlights this, and it's I think, very important. Secondly, and this is where I'll close, is on it's not just about elections, and I hope Lebanon moves forward with elections, and it's very important to do so. It's also the enabling environment for elections, meaning, is there enough freedom and freedom among the full range of actors who are important to a democracy? And as you know, as was reported in the last week or so, there have been several instances in which the freedoms of human rights researchers and journalists have been really stomped on through the Pegasus spyware, and including this prominent instance of a human rights watch researcher looking into that 2020 port blast people talked about. Well, again, going back to the Biden Summit for Democracy, it outlines a number of tools that our agencies could actually highlight. And I'll close here. These tools, again, the administration says it wants to use and to advance democracy and support democracy. Lebanon's a great case for that. It's a wonderful test case that does not fit within the frame that has been part of the overly partisan US foreign policy debate. It's not about US boots on the ground, though it's important for us to continue the support, I think, to the Lebanese armed forces there. It's largely about, are we going to use those tools of what you call it, smart power or soft power? Are we going to use this? And I think there's a template there. I think this administration would like to go there. The question is, will they prioritize it, Lebanon and the Lebanese people, I'd say, in their overall strategy? And that's where I think this report raises some really interesting pathways for them and points to a direction where they could go.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very, very, very helpful. And I look forward to continuing our discussion offline. But before we go to the Q&A, I want to ask the panelists, Paul, Ed, Joyce, and Brian, do you have any wrap-up comments or questions for your colleagues before we go to Q&A? Paul? You're okay, Ed? Joyce? Oh, Brian.
Now we have a long, we should engage the audience. So
Let's hear I go. Well, here we are. We're very much excited by that. So I'm going to start off with Paul. I'm looking at the questions. Fortunately, our staff has sent them to me. Remember, we've had a discussion now for over a year, and now it's resurrected again about a national dialogue in Lebanon. A call and bringing together of major representatives of people, government, NGOs, et cetera, to talk about and to come to some understanding of a national vision for the country. And also part of that is a national defense discussion. What do we do about maintaining the strategic stability of Lebanon when so much of it is threatened, shall we say, or undercut by the presence of Hezbollah in the country? Is there any value to having national dialogue?
Well, I would say, I mean, echoing a bit what Joyce said, there is kind of the short-term emergencies, and then there's the long-term. In the short term, we do have a governance system. We have elections coming up, which will lead to a prime minister and a government. We have presidential elections coming up to select a new president. We have elections to the new speaker of parliament. The current Lebanese political system as a system obviously has its faults, and I'll maybe talk about a few of them, but it is also, if properly held accountable, properly leveraged and used, certainly capable of implementing, the necessary urgent, minimal reforms that need to be done to stop the economic slide and begin a long and slow recovery. It should be able to coordinate with the international community urgent humanitarian aid. It's noteworthy that the Lebanese parliament and government has been an obstacle to getting international aid into people's pockets and into people's homes. So I would say we are where we are right now. We have political opportunities in the elections that are upcoming. The Lebanese people, at the end of the day, whether the participation is very high or very low, they vote. In most instances, it's votes that they believe in. So I think there's a lot on the Lebanese voter and the Lebanese people to step up and move forward. And there's a lot on the leaders that are in place or that might be in place after the elections to act. So I would say in the short term, we need to take urgent and rapid action. We don't have, let's say, the luxury to take a 2-year pause, do a complete dialogue, and rethink a number of things. But about the national dialogue and the big issues, I would point to two structural issues. One is the issue of the governance system, which was put in place after the Ta'if agreement. On the plus side, you could say the Ta'if agreement created a political system that was inclusive. That was a good thing. Before the Ta'if agreement, it's true that there was, particularly from one group or one confession, to be blunt, an overdue amount of power over the system that was a real big problem. So the Ta'if system, yes, is inclusive, and there's good things to be said about that. But the problem one of the problems of the Ta'if system is that there is no executive power in the government. And that is a crippling problem. What I mean by that is that the Lebanese government has no locus of executive power to make decisions, executive decisions, to get things done. The president effectively before Ta'if used to be the CEO and could get things done. After the Ta'if agreement, the president does not have the executive power. The prime minister, yes, his position, or hopefully her position at some point, the prime minister's position was made stronger than it was before, but the prime minister does not have executive power. Executive power is shared among all members of the cabinet, which effectively means, a large number of parties. Now, the result of that, and we see it even today, that nobody in the government, no one office is able to get things done. And that is a crippling problem of the Ta'if agreement. The associated problem with that is that it's difficult or complicated or difficult to hold the executive branch accountable, because in effect, they can always say, well, I wanted to, but so-and-so didn't let me. And in effect, that's true. The president cannot, issue an order and get things done. The prime minister, in most cases, cannot issue an order and get things done. So the Ta'if agreement on the executive side needs a major rethink. Secondly, the Ta'if agreement was supposed to move the country away from sectarianism. Sadly, 31 years later, it has entrenched sectarianism. We were supposed to establish a Senate where sectarian representation would be preserved, but the parliament would be liberated from sectarian representation. We were supposed to liberate a lot of appointments in government from sectarian considerations, and so on and so on. So yes, a lot needs to be done in the Lebanese and evolving the Lebanese formula, the Lebanese governance system, and one could have seminars and seminars about that. The second crippling issue is effectively the presence of Hezbollah. That this government and these people, no matter how they reform their governance system and no matter how much they are able to fight corruption or take some good decisions, The fact of the matter, the Lebanese state is not sovereign. It doesn't control its border. It doesn't control its territory. It doesn't control the decisions of war and peace. There is a full-fledged army that is in complete allegiance to a foreign country, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran, and they proudly say so, that does not answer to the Lebanese people, does not answer to the Lebanese government or the Lebanese parliament or the Lebanese state. That in itself is also a crippling problem. In the first issue, I think there could be progress made among Lebanese to discuss how to move forward and how to do all of that. I do not see that the Lebanese can engage what is effectively a group that's working with another country, completely pursuing another agenda. There isn't a common platform to discuss what people euphemistically call a national defense strategy. In effect, Hezbollah is there to deter the United States and Israel against attacking Iran. That's why it exists. And no negotiation among Lebanese is going to change that situation. So, and sadly, I don't see any significant change happening, nor do I see that being affected by talks in Geneva. With or without a return to the nuclear deal, Iran remains committed to an advanced defense strategy, remains committed to standing up militias in other countries. So far, it was Lebanon, and now it's Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. They see that as part of their national strategy, unfortunately. I don't see that changing, and certainly Lebanese negotiations, sadly, will not change that. Only change in Iran, in Tehran, or a change of policy from them will possibly convince them to abandon this strategy of having armies in other people's countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. It really gave us more than we probably want to think about in terms of trying to untie that Gordian knot, whatever it is, Gordian knot. And we've had a number of questions regarding elections and what the U.S. can do to help promote free and fair elections. Would you like to respond to that question?
Yeah, sure. And then maybe I go broader to follow Joyce's lead to think longer term as well. Sure. So I'm sure everyone has something to say about this. In the short term, I think that we've got to keep our feet to the fire and have elections on time. There was a question I noticed in the Q&A on what our position is on whether or not we would sanction anyone who gets in the way of free, fair, and timely elections. Our paper calls for that, as they'll see. We also call for the United States looking at putting money behind civil society to create a buzz in the community and get people inspired to vote. There's also an ability for the nonprofit sectors in our country, the NGOs, to engage the opposition groups there and help them get some ballast and support of their efforts as well. We're calling for the need for mega centers in Beirut in this report, and we're also saying that the diaspora vote in America should be counted by some objective observer, maybe an accounting firm, so that we know what the vote was in each city before it gets sent to Lebanon in a bag and put in the central bank. And of course, there are a number of other factors we're doing, like supporting the internal security forces, which, by the way, monitors and implements and ensures the elections being held freely. They have to put 17,000 troops out to do this in 6,000 locations. So that's all part of what we're pushing for as well. And we have other recommendations to add in our paper. Let me just jump, though, to the broader question, if I may, Jean, on where the United States is with Lebanon. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? I think is part of the discussion we're having here today. I think we have to realize that I believe that America maybe has not articulated a strategy, but they surely do have a strategy, and they're implementing it. And that strategy involves, for instance, Congress almost doubling the kind of funding for various humanitarian, security, education, health, and other issues. Sanctions continue. Part of the strategy, which we don't like, is what are we doing with Iran? The Biden administration said we're going to make it longer and stronger. Well, longer and stronger means dealing with terrorism proxies. They're not doing that. So that's an element where we have to weigh in. Of course, there's the election process in which they're pressing as well. And there has been a very strong diplomatic effort by allies pulling together to make sure the government addresses the needs of the people. So I think there are two failures, though. One is they're not articulating this in a policy venue. We see pieces of it. We see an open door, but I think the administration really needs to show us what the policy is, short and long term, and they haven't done that. In that sense, I think we have much more work to cut out for us. The glass is half full, the way I see it. And I believe that it's also going to be very difficult if we don't have a Lebanese partner. I mean, right now, Lebanon is probably one of the 10 recipients of foreign aid from the United States. Think about the issues that America is facing with Afghanistan and other countries around the world. We need a partner, and that partner has to show up this year. And it has to show up, number one, through the Mikati government reforms, and number two, supporting the Lebanese people on the ground and what they're demanding, and hopefully taking a step forward. So it's not there completely, but I think we've got the pieces together. Now we have to push to the next level.
Thank you, Ed. Very tough. Thanks for giving us those insights. Joyce, I'm going to talk with you about the Gulf. Paul's mentioned the importance of the Gulf. Ed's mentioned the importance of having a common vision to support Lebanon. We have the Kuwaiti foreign minister in Lebanon. We have the Qataris talking to the Lebanese. We have a number of initiatives underway, both on the table and behind the table. What is the vision or the view or the perspective of Lebanon in the Gulf? Will we see some more support for Lebanon? Is there support for the Lebanese people, not for the government? How is Lebanon perceived among our former partners in the GCC?
John, I think unfortunately Lebanon is not a priority when you look at the GCC priorities. I mean, if anything, Saad al-Hariri exit is just a big flag that he doesn't have political support or financial support from Saudi that would have equipped him to run in the election. So when the Gulf looks at, and I'm talking mainly about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, when they look at Lebanon, they see the elephant in the room, which is Hezbollah. They've tried to limit Hezbollah's influence, and it didn't succeed. They saw, Hezbollah even expand over the years, and it's now helping the Houthis in Yemen. They're more direct and immediate threat. So absent of a political institutions in Lebanon that could take GCC interests at heart, I don't foresee a big change in the Gulf calculations. Also, when you look at the Sunni street now, the void that has been created with Saad al-Hariri exiting the scene, that's a big question. Who's going to fill this void? Is it going to be another Hariri? Is it going to be somebody closer to Hezbollah? So I think they're in a wait and see mode until the next election. But also to point to this, one worrisome sign that I think both the US and the Gulf do in their approach to Lebanon is in believing that the humanitarian disaster, that the economic pressure will weaken Hezbollah. It's not necessarily true because, you know, Hezbollah is one of the few parties that has cash at hand that actually gives its supporters, you know, sometimes, what do you call them, credit cards and other forms of payment to use at grocery stores, at other avenues to pay for services. So they're more equipped to fill the void when the state is weakened. And that's something we do need to pay attention to, especially if the humanitarian situation worsens.
Thank you, Joyce. Brian, I need some insights from you, if you would, on some more regional perspectives. Lebanon, Israel. You know, everybody was saying, well, Lebanon should jump on the Abraham Accords bandwagon and normalize relations. Lebanon, Syria. Lebanon, Turkey. Lebanon, Jordan. Well, how do you see Lebanon's future or challenges with regard to its neighborhood?
It's a great question. And again, one of the things I wanted to emphasize was that there's so much tremendous human capital inside of Lebanon, the people itself and institutions that are truly disserved by many of its political leaders across the political spectrum. This is not, in a sense, the other failed states that you see in places like Afghanistan or Yemen or Libya. It's tremendous potential, plus its geographic location, as your question indicates, makes it essential for this question of the viability of the state system in the Middle East. In the first few months of the Biden administration, there was sort of a quiet little joke that some of the early appointees said, and it was actually a serious point, that when they looked at the Middle East, they had as the goal, no more failed states, right? So instead of maximalist, we're going to spread democracy and freedom, as we heard 20 years ago, or we're going to have a new equilibrium through an Iran nuclear deal, as we heard 10 years ago. It was an attempt that Brett McGurk has publicly, Brett McGurk, the White House coordinator on the Middle East, has described as back to basics. And again, it's not exactly pullback or restraint, as some of those advocates have called for, but it's, as I think Ed and others, not as clearly articulated. But Lebanon is central to all of these fronts. First, starting actually with the Gulf and the question that you asked Joyce. I went to Lebanon on this trip that I talked about earlier, and preceding that visit, I was in several Gulf countries, and on the way out of the Gulf country, on the way to Lebanon, one of the officials, Gulf officials, said, "Where are you going next?" And I said, "Well, we're going to Lebanon." And he said, "Why?" "It's lost." So this attitude of resignation among many in the Gulf, born out of, I think, their own inability and in some ways Gulf countries' incompetence in their own diplomacy to find the right way to support Lebanon and Lebanese people, is a key part of it. With Israel, quite clearly, and the report talks about this, the importance of even dialogue on gas supplies and energy supplies. I don't expect there to be any normalization accord anytime soon between Israel and Lebanon, given the internal political dynamics and the challenges that Lebanon faces. But let's be a little academic and we're at a think tank. Why not imagine that future where there's a different type of Lebanon, where that could be, and where the Lebanese people are actually benefiting for those interlinkages. And then, you know, you mentioned Turkey, but let me just highlight on Syria. Quite obviously, there's a tight interlinkage here with Syria. And in, again, my view that the Biden administration very much, you know, stays engaged in Syria in the counterterrorism fight. We're seeing that right now. We're seeing that in northeastern Syria in the undefeated threat of ISIS. But what we're not seeing, and I think it echoes its approach on Lebanon, we're not seeing this full spectrum approach to help the people of Syria in the way that, again, I think there's more, as Ed and you and others have indicated, in what the Biden administration has done for Lebanon. With Syria, we're seeing the bare minimum. And my broad point on all of this is, if you look at sort of human security dynamics and the social contract in these places, America is not going to fix this themselves. But what they can do is use these tools, that they've articulated in the sphere of diplomacy, in the sphere of economic engagement and anti-corruption, to actually help the Lebanese people try to deal with these things. Press on, as everyone has said, I think, with these Lebanese elections, but then help shift US policy away from this militarized approach, and one that actually is trying to provide benefit and helping not only the humanitarian situation, but then the basic freedoms of the Lebanese people. It won't change overnight. It's pretty bleak, but I think taking a step in that direction would be a good thing.
Thank you, Brian. Helpful. Paul, the reason I just went like this, the question keeps coming up, and I've been reading a series of articles that have come out over the last 6 months about one idea might be cantonization of Lebanon, or the Federation of Lebanon, or some way separating it into two different security zones or zones of influence. Is there any reality to these kinds of solutions or proposals?
Well, I mean, they're understandable searches for a structural solution. I understand them. But a lot of the solutions would require, if they were to be implemented peacefully, would require negotiation and agreement. The last time we had cantons was as the result of a violent collapse of the state and civil war, and then we got cantons. And certainly that wasn't a wonderful and forward-looking way to have a state move into the late 20th century, early 21st century. It was a result of a civil war. I know some people have floated some kind of idea of even separation, or as you say, two security zones. Or, I mean, because the reality is we have, you know, a Lebanese state with all of its faults and a Lebanese army, which has policies and positions, policies including its foreign policy. It has a defense policy. It abides by the 1701 UN agreement to police the South. It is the Lebanese state, okay, remains in a state of war with Israel, but it's not a hot war. There is a search to finish the maritime talks and border things, and you have, you know, that's the Lebanese state, Lebanese army. You have another army, Hezbollah, which answers to the Islamic Republic of Iran, which has a completely different agenda vis-a-vis Israel, certainly vis-a-vis the United States, and vis-a-vis Arab countries, and, you know, fighting wars in Yemen and Iraq and Syria and other places. Any attempt, you know, again, if you wanted to have separate zones, either that's going to be the result of a civil war and the collapse of the state, and then, you know, Hezbollah controls one part and different militias control other parts. In other words, those scenarios are not actually solutions. They're not something that can be proactively and productively approached and put in place. As I said, there are two structural problems in Lebanon. One is the problem of Hezbollah, which I don't think there isn't a Lebanese solution for it. There might be a regional solution one day. That is a problem that will continue. On the Lebanese side of things, I did talk about, you know, some major flaws of the Taif agreement. One is the absence of an executive, and the other is, rather than getting less sectarianism, we're getting more. An element that is in the Taif agreement that has not been implemented, which is very important, is administrative decentralization. And if you take administrative decentralization seriously, that, you know, that approaches a bit some of the concerns or the things that people raise about, you know, federalism or cantonization. In other words, currently, to get anything done in a Lebanese village or any Lebanese district, you have to go to the capital, and all the oligarchs representing the different communities have to make a deal, which is usually corrupt and power sharing and all of that. If you implement administrative decentralization, much of the day-to-day business of decision-making, development, building schools, fixing clinics, paving roads, would be done at the local regional level, without all of that central government obstructionism. Administrative decentralization is called for and is part of the TAF agreement. 31 years after that, it has not been implemented. There are draft laws in Parliament. There's draft fiscal laws that have been drafted. It's ready to be done. It should be done. It hasn't yet been done. I think, Lebanon's demography is not amenable to separation, and nor would I call for it. I think the Lebanese nation state, for better or for worse, and I hope it's for better, is destined to be a unified nation state and wants to be and needs to be. But we have some major problems that are currently making that very, very difficult. But I don't see solutions by moving away from a nation state and creating several nation states, or just dissolving it and going back to wartime cantons. I don't think that's a step forward.
Well, that's very, very, very helpful, Paul. I want to ask our speakers now for a quick 2-minute summary of your remarks or questions or thoughts you have. And we'll end with Ed and start with Joyce. Joyce, can you give us your 2 minutes brain wave?
I would just say that the report is comprehensive and encompassing of, maybe baby steps to take to get out of the crisis. The mega centers that Ed mentioned to mobilize the vote would be important if they happen. It's important to get the election on time. But I think, again, more urgently, the question of accountability in Lebanon is a primary one to address, as well as reforms, if we want to actually, build a country for the future, and if we want to end decades of impunity, whether it's, about assassinations, political assassinations. I would remind this week is the, 1 year, the assassination of Luqman Slim, activist, anti-Hezbollah writer, and we still don't have answers. There are also, big questions. Why is Hezbollah and others so scared of Judge Bitar when it comes to the port explosion investigation? So we need urgent answers to these questions. We need accountability. We need reforms for Lebanon, the country we call home and love dearly, to make it through 2022, and hopefully we through the next cycles of elections. And thank you for having us today. This was very informative and personal to many of us, but I did enjoy a lot and appreciated the conversation.
Thank you, Joyce. Brian, you want to take off your mute?
Yeah, sorry. You
No
figured
problem.
2 years into this, we would get that drill down, and I make it once a week, that mistake. So simple point, this report, and folks should read it, is, I think, concise and captures the challenges that the Lebanese people face and why that matters for America's not only national security interests, but its values. I think the Biden administration quite properly, in its first year, in its rhetoric, I think, highlighted a lot of the essential need for America to move back towards a focus on values and promoting democracy. And when I look at, as difficult as the situation is inside of Lebanon right now for millions of Lebanese people and Syrian refugees and others who are living there, this is an excellent place to dedicate more resources, use some of the tools that they themselves outlined, the Biden administration outlined, and do it in a way that actually builds bipartisan support. Again, I don't think it'll change the complexion of Lebanon and the scenario overnight. But as Ed and you and others have highlighted, it's important to stay engaged in this, because it's not only important for the Lebanese people, but for America's interest as well. So, and I hope this dialogue that you've started will spark a broader sense of action and what can be done. And importantly, also inside of Lebanon, and the need to actually for the Lebanese people to help have their voice at the table in this whole process.
Well, we look forward to keeping you engaged. Thanks, Brian. Paul?
Yeah, I would maybe use two words, help and hope. By help, I mean the urgent need now in these months and this year to provide urgent support on one hand to the sort of the pillar or pillars of the Lebanese state, particularly the army and the internal security forces. It's very significant that despite everything that's happened and the bankruptcies and all of that, the state has not completely collapsed. If the state completely collapses, which could happen in a week or two, it'll take a decade or two to get back from that disaster. So let's not minimize the importance that the state is still there in ways that it's not in some countries in the region. And as Brian said, if the US, one of its mantras with the Biden administration was no more failed states, Lebanon is failed in many, many ways, but it is not completely collapsed, and we must prevent it from completely collapsing. The other help was underlined by Joyce. Help the people urgently and widely. Part of that is humanitarian, of course, but part of it is to stem the brain drain or simply the human drain. That if current conditions continue, there will be, I don't want to say very little left of Lebanon to rebuild, but we will lose generations and generations of people for decades. And hence immediate help now to help the people, help keep people in the country would set us up well for a recovery. I said help and hope. The part about hope is the realization that the road ahead is long. Yes, we should hold elections in May. No, those elections are not going to solve all the problems. Yes, we need, parliament. We need presidential elections. No, that's not going to solve the problem. It's going to take a long time. Part of that long time is for the Lebanese political society, Lebanese people to change. The Lebanese people, I think, went along with a lot of what was happening in the country for many years, as long as things were okay, the economy was okay. People didn't pay much attention to politics. Same if politicians got elected. But I think much of the Lebanese public in 2019 awakened to their responsibilities. Now they've mobilized, they've done a lot. There's, a very rich opposition movement. Yes, we would have been happier if it were more united, if it were one united front. I understand there's a lot of viewpoints. And let me say that, okay, if that's not going to happen in a year or two, let's give it more time. There is something to be said in the dictum that was quoted many times that an old order is dying, but a new order has not yet been born. I hope that the Lebanese population and their friends around the world will continue to be hopeful and active to bring about something much better than what we have. There's no doubt that the Lebanese people, their capacities, their values are so much better than the political leadership and the political performance that we've seen. But until the people take more responsibility, hold their leaders accountable, become very active citizens, until that happens, I think political entrepreneurs and oligarchs and billionaires and whatever will continue to take advantage of the system. So I would say help and hope. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Paul. Ed, as the president of the leading advocacy and educational organization on U.S. Lebanon interests, you have quite a road ahead of you. And fortunately, you have the diaspora with you. You have people who are on this call with you. What are your final thoughts on today's webinar?
Well, clearly I'm behind this group, but hopefully we are working together to really move this agenda forward. Let me make a couple of points. One point is on Hezbollah. It's the 800-pound gorilla in the room. I must say, and I agree with Brian very much on this. If we don't get the Iran deal correct, we have missed our best chance of dealing with this outside pressure on the country of Lebanon. And so our work is cut out for us, and that's where we've got to really double down and try to work very hard. The United States should realize that they're in for some tough times by the Gulf, by Israel, by the Lebanese Americans, if in fact they don't deal with terrorism proxies in the region. So I really want to make that point to our policymakers listening. I also want to say, as Brian said, read the report. It's out there. We didn't cover a lot of things, but it's very comprehensive. And I think as I glance through the questions, we've covered a lot of those answers. So don't be discouraged that we didn't get to your point, because I think it is in the report. And I guess I would end by saying, I want to end on Paul's point of help and hope. Look, I see the glass half full. If we have a Lebanese partner, we can fill that glass up a lot quicker. We can't do this without a Lebanese partner. And there's a chance now for this government to show their ability to take risks to help their people. And we'll see how that goes. But remember, when it comes to the help part, our appropriations are nearly doubling across the board, not only for ration cards and help for the livelihoods of our troops and strengthening the ISF and the election process and civil society. Sanctions continue as well, and so many things that we have to help with. So let's work together to take this glass that may be half full and try to fill it up together. By working together, we're going to be heard. And that's the purpose of the study. They have 20 people sign on to a common strategy so that when we talk to the Hill, Congress, they hear one message. When we talk to the administration, they hear one message, rather than in the old days, people going up there and contradicting one another, leaving our policymakers with no room really to take decisions. So congratulations to Paul and his team, Brian, Joyce, thank you, and especially Jean for all your hard work to bring this together. And remember, there are 20 authors on that paper that also deserve a lot of credit because they put a lot into this. Thank you very much, Jean.
I just want to mention that if you go to the chat function, you'll find a link to the report if you don't have it, or go to ATFL or MEI's websites, and you'll also find the link there. Thank you very much. God help Lebanon. God help the United States. Thank you.